Cold light reflected off polished glass as Wyatt Carter stood at the center of the table. His voice was steady, deliberate, practiced. "I'm filing for divorce," he said, eyes barely resting on Leah. She was 6 months pregnant. Around them, colleagues froze mid-sentence. No one interrupted. No one defended her. Wyatt continued listing her failures as if presenting quarterly losses. Leah said nothing. She only watched him quietly, precisely the way one observes something already decided. Because what Wyatt didn't know was that every dollar funding his confidence belonged to her. If you believe moments like this reveal who people truly are, stay with this story until the end. And before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Subscribe if you believe silence can be stronger than revenge. Leah Hayes had learned early that visibility was a liability. Not in the dramatic sense people like to imagine no threats, no enemies waiting in shadows, but in the quieter, more persistent way, power attracted assumptions, expectations, distortions. Her father used to say that once people knew what you owned, they stopped seeing who you were. They spoke differently. They listened less. They measured every word against the weight of your last name. So Leah learned to step back. Not disappear, never that, but soften the edges of her presence. Speak less, observe more. Let conversations reveal themselves before she ever contributed to them. It wasn't shyness, it was discipline. By the time she inherited Hayes Global Holdings at 28, she already understood that control did not require visibility. The company, valued just under $900 million, did not carry her face in its branding, nor her name in its daily operations. Structurally, it was dispersed subsidiaries, layered leadership quiet boards. Publicly, it functioned like any other mid-sized American conglomerate. Privately, every major decision still traced back to her. Leah kept it that way. She lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn for years long, after she could have purchased entire blocks. She drove a car that never drew attention. Her wardrobe favored neutral tones, structured, understated, forgettable to anyone not paying close attention. And most people weren't. That was where Wyatt Carter entered her life. They met on a Thursday evening at a bookstore cafe in Soho, one of those places that tried not to look curated, but was. Wyatt had been standing in line behind her, impatient but polite, checking his phone between small movements forward. When Leah stepped aside after ordering, he glanced at the book in her hand. "Is it worth it?" he asked. It was not a remarkable question. It did not carry charm or intention beyond passing curiosity. But he waited for her answer. Fully, without interrupting. Leah noticed that. "It depends on whether you're reading to learn something," she said, "or to confirm what you already believe." Wyatt smiled, slightly surprised. "Which one are you doing?" She considered the question for a second longer than most people would have. "Neither. I'm reading to see what I missed." That was how it began. There was nothing strategic in the early days. Wyatt did not know who she was. Leah did not tell him. They met again the following week, then again after that. Coffee turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long walks through neighborhoods that didn't belong to either of them. Wyatt spoke about work often. He was a mid-level operations manager at Carter & Vale Logistics, a company recently acquired by a larger holding group, though he rarely mentioned the parent structure in detail. What mattered to him was momentum. He believed in upward movement, in measurable progress, in the clarity of effort leading to reward. "I just don't want to be average," he said once late at night, standing outside her building. "That's all." Leah understood that feeling. But she also understood something Wyatt did not yet see, that ambition, when left unchecked, had a way of reshaping what people considered acceptable. At the time, though, he was still grounded. He paid attention. He remembered things she said. He asked questions that didn't feel performative. When she was quiet, he didn't rush to fill the silence. When she spoke, he listened with a kind of focus that felt rare. It was enough. Their relationship moved forward without resistance. There were no dramatic declarations, no defining turning points. Just a steady accumulation of shared routines. Grocery lists, weekend plans, conversations about nothing in particular that somehow meant more than they should have. Wyatt proposed 18 months later, not in a grand setting, not with spectacle. Just a small restaurant, a simple ring, and a question that felt less like a performance and more like a continuation. Leah said yes. She did not tell him about Hayes Global. Not before the engagement, not during the wedding planning, not even after they were married. It wasn't fear. It wasn't manipulation. It was consistency. She had built her life on the premise that she would be known for who she was, not what she controlled. Telling Wyatt would have changed that equation instantly. And for a while, it didn't matter. The first year of their marriage was quiet in a way that felt stable. Wyatt continued working. Leah maintained her routines, some visible, most not. She traveled occasionally under the pretense of consulting work. He accepted it without questioning the details too deeply. They built something that resembled normal, until small shifts began to appear. Nothing obvious at first, just adjustments in tone, in timing. Wyatt started coming home later, explaining it as increased responsibility. His company was expanding. New leadership structures, more pressure. Leah believed him, because in part, it was true. Carter and Vail Logistics had been performing well. The acquisition facilitated through Hayes Global, months before Leah even met Wyatt, had positioned the company for growth. Internally, new management strategies were being implemented. Promotions were being considered. Wyatt was part of that trajectory. He worked harder. He spoke more about metrics, targets, internal politics. His language shifted subtly but noticeably from curiosity to certainty. "I think they're finally recognizing what I bring," he said one evening, loosening his tie as he stepped into their apartment. "It's about time." Leah nodded. "Recognition can change expectations." "It should," Wyatt replied. "That's the point." She didn't disagree, but she didn't elaborate either, because Leah had seen what happened next. She had seen how recognition, especially when it arrived faster than someone was prepared for, could alter behavior. Not immediately, not dramatically, but incrementally. Through small permissions, justifications, quiet adjustments in what felt acceptable. At the time, Wyatt was still standing at the edge of that shift. Leah watched carefully. It became a habit, not suspicion observation. She noted his patterns, his tone when he spoke about colleagues, the way he began referencing certain names more frequently, the slight impatience when conversations drifted away from his work. None of it was conclusive, but it was consistent. Around that same time, Leah noticed something else. She was late. At first, she didn't think much of it. Her schedule had been irregular. Travel meetings, long days that blurred together. But when the second week passed, she bought a test without telling Wyatt. She took it early in the morning. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that existed before the day imposed itself on everything. Leah stood in the bathroom watching the result appear with a steadiness that surprised even her. Positive. She didn't react immediately. No visible shift, no sudden emotion. Just a longer breath than usual, a hand resting lightly against the edge of the sink. Leah Hayes had spent years preparing for contingencies, for negotiations, for outcomes that required precision and control. But this was different. Not because it was unexpected, but because it introduced something she could not structure the same way. She sat down for a while after that. Not to process in the emotional sense, but to think, to consider timing, conversation, implications. When Wyatt woke up, she told him. He blinked, still half asleep. "You're serious?" Leah nodded. For a moment, just a moment, his expression softened. Not dramatically, not with overwhelming joy, but there was something there, a flicker of recognition that this mattered. "Okay," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, that's big." It was not the response people imagined in stories. but it was honest. Leah accepted that, because what mattered to her wasn't the performance of emotion, it was what followed. And what followed was silence. Not immediately, not in a way that could be pointed to. But gradually, Wyatt became more focused on work, more distracted during conversations, more distant in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Leah did not confront him, not because she didn't notice, but because she was waiting to see whether this was pressure or preference, because those two things looked similar at the beginning. But they led to very different endings. And Leah already knew long before Wyatt would that she would not need to raise her voice to understand which one it was. The change did not arrive all at once. If it had, it would have been easier to name, easier to confront, easier perhaps to forgive. Instead, it unfolded in fragments, small enough to dismiss individually but consistent enough to form a pattern when observed without interruption. Leah Hayes did not interrupt. She noticed the first shift in Wyatt's timing. He began coming home later than usual, though not late enough to raise immediate concern. 30 minutes, then 45. Then an hour explained with the same steady tone each time. Quarter-end reports, internal review meetings, leadership check-ins. All reasonable, all believable. Leah never asked for proof. Not because she trusted blindly, but because she understood something Wyatt had not yet realized: people reveal more when they are not being questioned. So she let the explanations exist as they were. And she watched what followed. It was the phone eventually. Wyatt had never been secretive about it before. He would leave it on the table, step away without hesitation, answer messages casually in front of her. There was no tension in his behavior. That changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to as betrayal, but in the subtle tightening of routine. The phone shifted from the table to his pocket. Notifications were silenced. Screen angles adjusted instinctively when messages appeared. He did not hide it. He managed it. There was a difference. Leah noticed the difference. One evening, as he stepped into the shower, his phone lit up briefly on the kitchen counter. Just a flicker of light in an otherwise quiet room. Leah did not reach for it immediately. She stood where she was, allowing the moment to pass naturally. Then, after a few seconds, she walked over, not hurried, not hesitant, and glanced down. A name. Lila Monroe. The message preview was short. "You left before I could say goodnight." Leah read it once. Then she stepped back. No reaction, no visible shift, just a quiet recognition. The water continued running in the bathroom. Wyatt moved behind the closed door, unaware that something had just been confirmed, not through confrontation, but through absence of care. Leah returned to her seat. She did not open the phone again, because she did not need to. From that point forward, she adjusted her attention not outwardly, but internally. She began to track details with more precision. Times, patterns, language. She kept a small notebook in the drawer beside her desk. It had always been their use for various things: ideas, reminders, fragments of thought. Now its purpose shifted. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just consistently. She wrote down the date, the time, the name Lila Monroe. Nothing else. Over the following weeks, more details filled the pages. Late meetings that aligned too closely with social hours. Work trips that extended just slightly beyond necessity. Changes in Wyatt's tone when certain topics arose. He spoke of Lila occasionally, but always in professional terms. "She's sharp," he said, once scrolling through something on his laptop. "Knows how to navigate people." Leah nodded. "That's a useful skill." Wyatt didn't look up. Yeah, not everyone has it. It wasn't an insult. But it wasn't neutral either. Leah wrote that down later. Not the words exactly, but the shift behind them. What interested her was not the existence of another person. It was the evolution of Wyatt's perception. Because betrayal rarely begins with action. It begins with permission. And permission often reveals itself through language, long before behavior becomes undeniable. Weeks passed. The distance between them grew not through conflict, but through absence. Conversations shortened. Shared routines dissolved. Even meals became less consistent. Wyatt ate out more often, said it was easier with his schedule. Leah adapted. She adjusted her expectations without announcing the change. She stopped waiting for him to come home at specific times. She reorganized her days around what was certain, not what was promised. Outwardly, nothing appeared broken. Internally, everything was being documented. One afternoon, Leah sat in a quiet cafe near her office, one of the few places where she allowed herself to think without interruption. Her notebook lay open beside her coffee, filled with entries that to anyone else would seem insignificant. To her, they were structure. She wasn't building a case. Not yet. She was establishing clarity, because clarity removed the need for speculation. And speculation was where people made mistakes. Her phone buzzed lightly on the table. An email. Not from Wyatt. From an internal system she rarely accessed directly, but still monitored when necessary. Carter and Vale Logistics. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she finished her coffee, closed her notebook, and stepped outside. The city moved around her with its usual indifference, cars' voices, fragments of conversation that carried no weight beyond their moment. Then she opened the email. It was routine. Operational summaries, department updates, expense reports aggregated at a level most executives would skim. Leah didn't skim. She read, not line by line, but pattern by pattern. Numbers had a way of telling stories when placed correctly. And what she noticed was not large, not alarming, but consistent. Certain expense categories had increased slightly over the past quarter. Nothing that would trigger an audit, nothing that would stand out to anyone not looking for alignment. But Leah was looking. She cross-referenced dates, compared them quietly with the entries in her notebook, and found overlap. Again, not dramatic, but present. She closed the report, not because she was finished, but because she had confirmed enough for now. This was no longer about suspicion. It was about trajectory. That evening, Wyatt came home later than usual. He looked tired, but not in the way exhaustion manifests. More like someone managing multiple narratives at once. Long day, Leah asked, her tone even. Yeah, he said, dropping his keys onto the counter. A lot going on. She nodded. Anything specific? Wyatt hesitated for half a second. Just work, he replied. It was a small hesitation, but it existed, Leah noticed. She didn't press further. Instead, she shifted the conversation to something neutral: dinner, scheduling, small logistics that required no emotional investment. Wyatt responded easily. Too easily, as if relieved. That too was noted. Later that night, as he slept beside her, Leah remained awake for a while longer. Not staring at the ceiling, not lost in thought. Just present, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, measuring the distance that now existed, not physically, but structurally. She placed a hand lightly over her abdomen, a quiet, grounding gesture. There was a life forming there, something that would not wait for clarity, something that would not adapt to ambiguity. Leah understood that her decisions moving forward would not only affect her, but someone else. Entirely. And that changed the equation, not emotionally, but strategically, because whatever Wyatt was becoming, Leah could already see where it led, and she would not allow uncertainty to define the outcome. The next morning, she made a call, not urgent, not dramatic, just precise. Daniel, she said, when the line connected, I'd like to begin reviewing some documents. There was a pause on the other end. Not surprise, recognition. Of course, Daniel Brooks replied. What kind of documents? Leah glanced at the closed notebook on her desk. Everything that might matter later, she said. No accusation, no explanation, just intention. And for the first time since the shift began, the situation moved from observation to preparation. Promotion did not change Wyatt Carter overnight. It refined what was already there. The announcement came on a Monday morning, delivered through a company-wide email with the usual language measured congratulatory, carefully structured, to suggest both merit and inevitability. Wyatt Carter, Senior Operations Director. Leah read it at her desk long before Wyatt mentioned it. She noticed the phrasing, the subtle emphasis on leadership potential, the internal endorsement from upper management names she recognized, though Wyatt never questioned how she did. She closed the email without reaction. That evening, Wyatt came home earlier than he had in weeks. There was energy in the way he moved, controlled but unmistakable. He set his keys down with more force than usual, loosened his tie before speaking. "I got it," he said. Leah looked up from the kitchen counter. "The promotion," he nodded. "Yeah. Senior Director." There was a pause, brief but present, as if he expected something more. A reaction. A shift. Leah stepped closer, her expression steady. "Congratulations, Wyatt." He studied her face for a moment. Not suspicious, not disappointed, just evaluating. "Thanks," he said, quieter now. For a few seconds, the room held something familiar, a version of them that had existed before the distance began, before the late nights and unanswered questions. Then it passed. Wyatt reached for his phone. "Team dinner tonight," he added. "Celebration." Leah nodded. Of course. He didn't invite her. Not directly, not indirectly. It wasn't an oversight. It was a decision. Leah recognized it as such. "Will you be late?" she asked. "Probably," Wyatt replied. "Depends how long it goes." It was the same answer he had given before. But now it carried a different weight, because this time the absence was intentional. After he left, Leah stood in the quiet apartment for a while, not reflecting, not reacting, just adjusting. She moved through the space, methodically cleaning, organizing, preparing dinner for one, without altering her routine more than necessary. Control was not about forcing change. It was about maintaining structure when change occurred. Later that night, her phone buzzed. Not a message, a tagged photo. She opened it without hesitation. A group of colleagues seated around a long table. Glasses raised, smiles captured mid-laughter. Wyatt sat near the center. Next to him, Lila Monroe. Close enough that their shoulders touched. Close enough that the framing suggested familiarity, not coincidence. Leah looked at the image for exactly 3 seconds. Then she closed it. No further inspection, no enlargement, no search for details. Because the details were already clear. The following days confirmed what the photo suggested. Wyatt's schedule changed again this time, with less effort to explain it. He no longer framed his absence as necessity. He presented it as expectation. "Comes with the role," he said one morning, scanning emails while standing instead of sitting. Leah watched him quietly. Responsibility or visibility? Wyatt glanced up briefly. Both. It was not an incorrect answer, but it was incomplete. And Leah noticed that too. With the promotion came a shift in Wyatt's language. He spoke differently now, not just about work, but about value. "People either keep up or they don't," he said one evening, pacing slowly as he talked. "There's no space for dead weight at this level." Leah remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "And how do you define that?" Wyatt stopped for a second. "Contribution," he said. "Tangible, measurable." Leah held his gaze. Not everything measurable is visible. Wyatt gave a short, dismissive smile. "That sounds nice. But in the real world, it doesn't mean much." It was the first time his tone carried something sharper than distance. Not anger, not hostility, just dismissal. Leah registered it without reacting. Because what mattered was not the statement itself, but the certainty behind it. Wyatt no longer questioned his own framework. He had accepted it as truth. And that changed how he evaluated everything around him, including her. The shift became more visible in social settings. Wyatt began attending more events, networking dinners, corporate gatherings, informal meetings that blurred the line between business and personal life. Leah was invited less frequently. When she did attend, the difference in atmosphere was immediate. People spoke to Wyatt. They acknowledged Leah. The distinction was subtle but consistent. At one event held in a private lounge overlooking the city, Leah stood beside Wyatt as he spoke with a small group of colleagues. Jason Reed was there, his tone easy familiar. Megan Holt composed and observant, standing just slightly outside the circle. "And this is Leah," Wyatt said at one point almost as an afterthought. There was no introduction beyond her name, no context, no acknowledgement, just a placeholder. Megan smiled politely. "Nice to meet you." Leah returned the smile. "You as well." Jason nodded. "Wyatt's told us a bit about you." Leah tilted her head slightly. "Only a bit," Jason chuckled, but didn't elaborate. Because there was nothing to elaborate on. Wyatt had not given them anything. And that too was intentional. The conversation moved on quickly back to work, to strategy, to internal discussions that excluded Leah without explicitly doing so. She did not interrupt. She did not insert herself. She observed. Not the words, but the structure. Who spoke? Who listened? Who deferred? Where Wyatt positioned himself within that hierarchy. And how comfortable he had become there. At some point during the evening, Lila Monroe joined the group. Her presence shifted the dynamic almost immediately. Not dramatically, but noticeably. She greeted Wyatt first. Not formally, not casually. Something in between. "Didn't think you'd make it," she said, her tone light. Wyatt smiled. Had to. Leah watched the exchange without expression. Lila turned to her, offering a brief glance. "Hi." No introduction. No acknowledgement of who Leah was. Just recognition of presence. Leah nodded. "Hello," that was all. No tension, no confrontation, just clarity. Later that night, as they returned home, Wyatt seemed energized. "Good group tonight," he said, removing his jacket. "Smart people." Leah placed her bag down carefully. They seemed aligned. Wyatt glanced at her. "That's important." There was a pause. Then almost casually he added, "You don't have to come to those if you don't want to." Leah looked at him, not questioning, not offended, just aware. "I'll decide that myself," she said. Wyatt shrugged. "Just saying. It's not really your environment." The statement lingered in the space between them. Not loud, not aggressive, but definitive. Leah nodded once. "I understand," she replied. And she did. Because Wyatt had just defined the boundary, not of the room, but of how he saw her. The following week, Leah scheduled a meeting, not with Wyatt, with Daniel Brooks. His office was quiet, structured, designed for conversations that required precision rather than comfort. Daniel greeted her with the same measured professionalism he always maintained. "Leah," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from him. "What can I help you with?" She sat down, placing a thin folder on the table. "I'd like to formalize documentation," she said. Daniel studied her for a moment. Personal or corporate? Leah met his gaze. Both. There was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, just direction. Daniel nodded slowly. Understood. He opened the folder. Inside were notes, dates, references, not conclusions, not accusations, just information, carefully organized, deliberately incomplete because it was still being built. Daniel looked up. "You've been tracking this for a while." Leah didn't answer directly. "I want everything structured correctly," she said, "before it becomes necessary." Daniel closed the folder. "That's usually when people come to me," he said, "after it becomes necessary." Leah allowed a brief pause. "I prefer not to wait," she replied. And in that moment, the situation shifted again. Not in Wyatt's world, not yet, but in Leah's. Because what had been observation was now becoming infrastructure. Leah Hayes did not initiate audits lightly. In most cases, she avoided them altogether. Audits created noise. They disrupted internal balance. They forced people into defensive positions, which often produced less truth, not more. Leah preferred observation quiet, continuous, unannounced. But observation, when it reached a certain threshold, required structure. That threshold had been crossed. The meeting with Margaret Ellis took place on a Wednesday morning scheduled under a neutral subject line that would not attract attention. Margaret had been with Hayes Global Holdings for over 2 decades. She had worked alongside Leah's father, then transitioned seamlessly into supporting Leah after the transfer of ownership. She was precise, discreet, loyal not in the emotional sense, but in the professional one that mattered more. Margaret did not ask unnecessary questions. She entered the room, closed the door behind her, and took her seat without commentary. "You wanted to review Carter and Vale?" she asked. Leah nodded once. "A limited scope." Margaret folded her hands neatly on the table. "Financial or operational financial," Leah replied. But indirectly. Margaret understood immediately. "Monitoring without triggering review protocols," she said. Leah met her eyes. "Exactly." Margaret gave a small nod. "What specifically are we looking for?" Leah slid a document across the table. It was not labeled, not formally structured, just a list of dates, transaction references, and internal codes enough for someone like Margaret to interpret without explanation. Margaret scanned it briefly. "These are expense clusters," she said. "Non-critical categories." "Yes, they wouldn't be flagged under normal thresholds." "I know." Margaret looked up. "You believe they should be?" Leah did not answer directly. "I want clarity," she said. Margaret closed the document. "That can be arranged," she replied. There were no further questions, because the nature of the request did not require them. The process began quietly. No system alerts, no formal notices, just a reallocation of attention within existing reporting structures. Margaret adjusted internal review parameters in a way that appeared routine minor shifts in oversight that would not raise concern unless someone was actively looking for them. Wyatt Carter was not. His focus was elsewhere. Over the next 2 weeks, data accumulated. Not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm an external auditor, but in patterns. Always patterns. Margaret compiled the information into a series of internal summaries, clean structured, devoid of interpretation. She did not draw conclusions. She presented alignment. Leah reviewed each report carefully. She did not rush. She did not skip ahead. Because what mattered was not the presence of irregularities, but their consistency. And consistency was emerging. Expense reports tied to Wyatt's department showed incremental increases in discretionary spending. Travel costs slightly above standard ranges. Client entertainment expenses that exceeded expected ratios. Individually, each entry was justifiable. Collectively, they suggested something else. Leah cross-referenced the dates again, with her notebook, with her memory, and with something she had not yet shared with anyone. A second layer of information, not from the company, from Wyatt. One evening, while he was in the living room taking a call, Leah sat at the dining table with her laptop open, not working, not searching, just present. Wyatt's voice carried lightly through the apartment, low-controlled but relaxed, in a way it had not been with her in weeks. "Yeah," he said. "I saw that. We can shift it." A pause. "No, don't put it through the standard channel, just adjust the category." Another pause. "It's cleaner that way." Leah did not look up. She did not react, but she listened. Not to the words, but to the structure behind them. After the call ended, Wyatt returned to the table, his expression neutral. "Just work," he said, almost automatically. Leah nodded. Of course. She did not ask what kind of work, because the answer would not have been truthful. And truth in this situation was no longer something Wyatt was offering voluntarily. The next report from Margaret arrived the following morning. Leah opened it slowly. This time, the alignment was clearer. Certain expenses categorized under client engagement matched dates that had no corresponding client meetings in the official schedule, locations that did not align with declared business trips. And one name appeared repeatedly, not in the main reports, but in supporting documentation. Lila Monroe, not as a recipient, not directly, but as a participant in events tied to those expenses. Leah read the name without reaction. She closed the file, then opened it again, not to confirm but to observe the pattern one more time, because patterns once established became difficult to deny. That afternoon, Leah met with Daniel Brooks again. This time she brought more than notes. She brought structure. Daniel reviewed the documents in silence, his expression unchanged as he moved through the pages. When he finished, he placed them neatly back on the table. "This is still preliminary," he said. "Yes, but it's directional." Leah nodded. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Are you looking to act on this?" Now Leah considered the question. "No," she said. Daniel studied her for a moment. "Then what's the objective?" Leah's answer came without hesitation. "Completion." Daniel's expression shifted just slightly. "You want the full picture," he said. "Yes." "Before making any move." "Yes." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's wise," he said. Leah did not respond to the evaluation, because this was not about strategy in the abstract. It was about timing. And timing in Leah's world was not reactive. It was constructed. Over the following days, Wyatt's behavior continued along the same trajectory. More time away, less engagement at home, and a growing sense of certainty in how he carried himself. He no longer explained his schedule in detail. He no longer framed his decisions as shared. He simply moved forward, as if the structure of the marriage had already shifted, as if the outcome had already been decided. Leah allowed that perception to exist, because it served a purpose. The less Wyatt questioned, the more he revealed. And revelation, when unforced, was always more complete. One evening, Wyatt mentioned a trip. "Chicago," he said, checking his calendar. 2 days, maybe 3. Leah nodded. "Business, yeah." There was no elaboration, no attempt to justify, just a statement. Leah made a note of the dates later that night, not because she doubted the trip, but because she understood how it would appear in the records. And she was right. The expense report arrived 3 days after his return. Flight, hotel, meals, all standard, all within acceptable ranges, except for one entry, a dinner, significantly higher than the rest. 2 attendees, no client listed. Leah did not need confirmation, but confirmation would come anyway. Margaret flagged the entry in the next summary not as an issue, but as an anomaly. Leah read the note once, then closed the file. She did not confront Wyatt. She did not adjust her behavior. She did not accelerate the process, because acceleration introduced risk. And Leah was not interested in risk. She was interested in certainty. That night, as Wyatt slept beside her, Leah remained still. Not awake, not restless, just present. Her hand rested lightly against her abdomen again, a quiet, grounding gesture that had become familiar. There was movement now, subtle but undeniable, a reminder that time was not abstract. It was progressing, and with it, so was everything else. Leah understood that what she was building quietly, deliberately, would eventually reach a point where it could no longer remain unseen. But that point had not yet arrived. And until it did, she would continue, not reacting, not confronting, just documenting. Because when the moment came, there would be no need to raise her voice. The structure would speak for her. By the time Wyatt Carter began preparing for divorce, he had already convinced himself it was justified. Not in a dramatic sense, not with declarations of unhappiness or betrayal, but in the quieter, more dangerous way through internal narratives that reframed his actions as necessary, even reasonable. Leah Hayes could see that shift long before he spoke it aloud, because justification always arrived before decision. And Wyatt had been justifying for weeks. It showed in how he spoke about time. "I can't keep balancing everything," he said one evening, standing near the window, his reflection faint against the glass. "Something has to give." Leah remained seated, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. "Balance implies equal weight." Wyatt exhaled slowly. You know what I mean. She did, but she also understood what he wasn't saying, that the weight he referred to was no longer shared, that in his mind, certain parts of his life had become optional, and Leah was beginning to fall into that category. I'm just being realistic, Wyatt added, turning slightly toward her. Things change. Leah nodded once. They do. There was no argument, no attempt to redirect the conversation, because Leah had already moved past the point where words would alter outcome. What mattered now was alignment, and alignment was becoming clearer with each passing day. Wyatt's connection with Lila Monroe was no longer confined to implication. It had shifted into visibility. Not public, not in a way that would draw formal attention, but within the boundaries of his professional environment, it had become understood. Unspoken, but recognized. Leah confirmed this, not through confrontation, but through access. Margaret Ellis provided the structural view, expense reports, internal scheduling, overlapping travel records. But Leah also had something else. Internal communication logs, not content, metadata, timestamps, frequency, duration, patterns. And the patterns were consistent. Wyatt and Lila communicated outside standard working hours. Late evenings, early mornings, weekends. Not always extensively, but regularly. Enough to establish continuity. Leah did not need to read their messages. She did not need to see confirmation in explicit terms, because behavior, when mapped correctly, rarely required interpretation. It simply required acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Wyatt began consulting his own legal counsel. Leah learned this not through him, but through Daniel Brooks. Kevin Doyle, Daniel said during one of their scheduled meetings. He's been making inquiries. Leah didn't react. On Wyatt's behalf, she asked. Daniel nodded. Preliminary, asset positioning, general divorce structuring. Leah considered that for a moment. He's early, Daniel added, but intentional. Leah folded her hands lightly on the table. What's his approach? Daniel glanced at his notes. Standard. He's assuming a traditional asset division, possibly aiming to limit spousal support based on perceived contribution. Leah's expression remained neutral. Perceived, she repeated. Daniel met her gaze. He doesn't know. Leah didn't answer, because that was the central variable. Wyatt was building a case based on incomplete information. That made his strategy fragile. But fragility, when unrecognized, often appeared as confidence. Leah allowed that confidence to grow, because the more certain Wyatt became, the less careful he would be. And carelessness in situations like this was not dramatic. It was incremental. It appeared in details, in overlooked documentation, in assumptions that went unverified. Leah was waiting for those. At home, the distance between them had settled into something almost functional. They moved around each other without friction. Conversations were minimal, efficient, focused on logistics. Meals were no longer shared consistently, schedules rarely aligned. From the outside, it might have appeared peaceful, but peace in this case was not resolution. It was absence. One evening, Wyatt brought it up directly. I think we should talk, he said, standing in the doorway of the living room. Leah looked up from her notebook, not startled, not hesitant. About what she asked. Wyatt stepped inside, his posture controlled. About where this is going. Leah closed the notebook slowly. I see, she said. Wyatt exhaled as if preparing to explain something he had already decided. I don't think this is working, he continued. Not the way it should. Leah held his gaze. Define working. Wyatt frowned slightly. You know what I mean. Leah did not respond immediately, because she wanted him to continue. And he did. There's no alignment anymore, he said. Different priorities, different expectations. Leah nodded once. And when did that change? Wyatt hesitated, not because he didn't have an answer, but because the answer would require him to acknowledge timing. And timing would reveal causation. I don't know, he said finally, gradually. Leah accepted that, because gradual change was more difficult to defend. It lacked a clear starting point. It blurred responsibility. "I think it's better to be honest about it," Wyatt added, "before things get worse." Leah's expression remained steady. "Worse for whom?" she asked. Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. "For both of us," he said. It was the expected answer. Balanced, neutral, but not accurate. Because the outcome Wyatt was preparing for was not balanced. It was structured in his favor. Leah understood that. And she allowed the conversation to end there. No confrontation, no escalation, just acknowledgement. "Then you should proceed," she said. Wyatt looked at her, momentarily caught off guard. "That's it?" he asked. Leah tilted her head slightly. What else would you expect? Wyatt studied her face, searching for something: resistance, emotion, reaction. There was none. And that unsettled him more than any argument would have. "I'll talk to a lawyer," he said. Leah nodded. That would be appropriate. The conversation ended without resolution. But resolution in this case had already been decided, just not by Wyatt. Over the next week, his behavior shifted again, not in distance, but in calculation. He became more deliberate in how he managed finances, more attentive to documentation, more careful in how he framed conversations. He believed he was preparing, and in a sense he was. But preparation without full information often led to miscalculation, and miscalculation, when embedded in legal processes, became evidence. Leah continued her own work, quietly, methodically. She and Daniel finalized the structure of her legal position. Not filing, not yet, but ready. Every document categorized, every timeline aligned, every inconsistency mapped. And within that structure, a second layer existed: corporate exposure. Because Wyatt's actions were not confined to personal boundaries. They extended into professional conduct. And that created risk. Not for Leah, for him. Margaret Ellis confirmed it during their next meeting. "The patterns are stable," she said, "and expanding." Leah nodded. Enough to formalize. Margaret considered for a moment. "Yes," she said, "but not yet visible to external auditors." Leah closed the file in front of her. "Good," she replied. Margaret looked at her carefully. "You're waiting?" Leah met her gaze. "Yes." "For what?" Leah paused briefly, then answered. "For him to finish." Margaret didn't ask what that meant, because she understood. Wyatt Carter was building something. A narrative. A legal position. A version of events that justified his decisions. Leah was allowing him to complete it, because once it was complete, it would be easier to dismantle. Not through argument, not through confrontation, but through structure. And structure, unlike emotion, did not require volume. It required precision. That night, Leah stood by the window, looking out over the city. Lights moved in the distance, cars, signals, reflections that carried no meaning beyond motion. Behind her, the apartment was quiet. Wyatt had not come home yet. Leah placed her hand lightly against her abdomen again. The movement there was stronger now, more defined, a presence that did not depend on uncertainty. And in that moment, Leah understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever happened next would not be about preserving what had already changed. It would be about protecting what had not yet begun. And for that, she would not need to say a single word. Leah Hayes did not believe in reacting to events. She believed in preparing for them before they arrived. By the time Wyatt Carter had his first formal consultation with Kevin Doyle, Leah had already completed 3 structured reviews with Daniel Brooks, not to accelerate action, but to remove uncertainty. Preparation in Leah's world was not about speed. It was about completeness. Daniel's office had become a consistent space over the past few weeks. Not frequent enough to suggest urgency, but regular enough to establish continuity. Each meeting built upon the last documents, layered over timelines, observations aligned with verifiable data. Nothing speculative, nothing emotional, just structure. On this particular afternoon, the folder Leah placed on Daniel's desk was thicker than before. Not significantly, but noticeably. Daniel opened it without commentary, scanning the contents, with the same controlled focus he always maintained. Pages turned quietly. Notes were reviewed without interruption. Occasionally, he paused, not because something surprised him, but because something confirmed a pattern he had been expecting. When he finished, he closed the folder carefully. "This is sufficient," he said. Leah didn't respond immediately. "Define sufficient," she said. Daniel leaned back slightly. "For legal positioning, you already have enough to proceed." Leah considered that. "And for outcome?" she asked. Daniel's expression shifted just slightly. "That depends on what outcome you're aiming for." Leah folded her hands lightly in front of her. "Clarity," she said. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You already have clarity," he replied. Leah shook her head once. "I have direction," she said, "not completion." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood the distinction. Direction suggested where things were going. Completion ensured they could not go anywhere else. "You're waiting for him to formalize," Daniel said. "Yes, to initiate." "Yes." Daniel tapped the folder lightly with his fingers. "That gives you an advantage," he said. Leah's gaze remained steady. "It gives me structure," she corrected. Daniel allowed a brief pause. "Then we align with that," he said. The strategy was not aggressive. It was patient. Leah would not file first. She would not confront. She would not introduce information prematurely. Instead, she would allow Wyatt to define his position, legally, financially, narratively. And once that position was fixed, she would respond. Not emotionally, but precisely. The documents in front of them reflected that approach. A timeline of behavior, a record of financial inconsistencies, metadata from internal communications. Not invasive, not illegal, just aligned. And within that alignment, a second layer existed: corporate exposure. Daniel turned to that section next. "This part," he said, "changes the context." Leah nodded. "Yes." Daniel adjusted his posture slightly. "If his financial activity intersects with company resources, this is no longer just a divorce matter. I'm aware." Daniel met her gaze. "That expands consequences." Leah didn't look away. "I'm not expanding anything," she said. "I'm documenting what already exists." Daniel accepted that because it was accurate. Leah was not creating a case. She was revealing one. And that distinction mattered. "Then we proceed in parallel," Daniel said. "Personal and corporate, but separate." Leah nodded. "Keep them independent. That protects you." "It protects the structure," she replied. Daniel closed the folder. "Then we're ready," he said. Leah stood gathering the documents without urgency. "Not yet," she said. Daniel didn't question it, because readiness and action were not the same. And Leah Hayes never confused the two. Outside the legal framework, Wyatt Carter was moving forward with his own preparations. His meetings with Kevin Doyle had progressed from preliminary discussions to structured planning. Asset division models, income projections, strategic positioning that assumed a certain narrative would hold. That narrative was simple: irreconcilable differences, unequal contribution, a marriage that had, in his words, lost alignment. Kevin Doyle had no reason to challenge that narrative, because Wyatt presented it with confidence, and confidence, when untested, often passed as credibility. "What about assets in her name?" Kevin asked during one session. Wyatt shrugged slightly. "There's not much. She doesn't really work like that." Kevin made a note. "An income minimal," Wyatt replied. "Consulting maybe, nothing significant." Kevin nodded. From a legal standpoint, the structure seemed straightforward. From Wyatt's perspective, it was. From Leah's, it was incomplete. And incompleteness, when formalized, became vulnerability. At home, the dynamic between them had stabilized into something almost mechanical. They shared space, but not presence. Conversations were reduced to logistics, schedules, appointments, surface-level exchanges that required no engagement beyond necessity. Wyatt no longer attempted to explain his absences. Leah no longer asked. The silence between them was not heavy. It was structured. One evening, Wyatt returned earlier than expected. Leah was seated at the dining table, reviewing a set of documents not visibly identifiable, but organized with the same precision she applied to everything else. "You're home early," she said without looking up. "Meeting got canceled," Wyatt replied, placing his jacket over the chair. There was a pause, then he spoke again. "I've been talking to a lawyer." Leah lifted her gaze. Not surprised, not concerned, just attentive. "I assumed you would," she said. Wyatt studied her expression, searching for something resistance, perhaps, or reaction. There was none. "I think it's better to handle this cleanly," he continued. "No complications." Leah nodded once. "Clarity is efficient." Wyatt frowned slightly. "That's not exactly what I meant." Leah tilted her head. "Then what did you mean?" Wyatt hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the answer, when spoken directly, would expose intention. "I just don't want this to become messy," he said. Leah held his gaze. "Then it won't," she replied. Her tone was calm, certain, and that certainty unsettled him more than disagreement would have, because Wyatt was expecting negotiation. Leah was offering resolution, without terms, without resistance, without visible strategy, and that absence of opposition made it difficult for him to measure his own position. "Okay," he said finally. Leah returned her attention to the documents. The conversation ended, not because it was resolved, but because it had reached its limit. Later that night, Wyatt sat alone in the living room, his phone in hand. A message thread remained open. Lila Monroe. Everything set she had asked. Wyatt stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Almost. There was a pause. Then another message. Soon. He set the phone down. Leah, in the next room, closed her notebook, not reacting, not questioning, just recording. Because everything Wyatt believed he was preparing, he was also revealing. And Leah was no longer observing passively. She was structuring, aligning, finalizing, not for confrontation, but for completion. The following morning, Leah made one final call, not to Daniel, not to Margaret, to a private record specialist, someone who operated within legal boundaries, but with a level of discretion that standard processes did not offer. "I need verification," she said, of what the voice on the other end asked. Leah paused briefly, then answered, "Continuity." There was no need to explain further, because continuity, once established, removed doubt. And doubt was the only variable Leah had not yet eliminated. By the end of the week, she would have it. Not assumptions, not patterns, confirmation. And once confirmation was complete, there would be nothing left to wait for. Because the moment Wyatt Carter believed he was ready to end the marriage, Leah Hayes would already be prepared to define its conclusion. By the time absence becomes routine, it stops asking for permission. It simply replaces presence. Leah Hayes recognized that shift in Wyatt Carter long before it stabilized into habit. What had once been explained as workload had now settled into something quieter, more permanent distance, without justification. Wyatt no longer framed his absence as temporary. He lived inside it. He left earlier, returned later. Sometimes, not at all. When he did come home, his presence felt transitional, as if the apartment had become a place he passed through rather than belonged to. Leah adjusted without acknowledgement, not to accommodate him, but to maintain consistency within herself. She woke at the same time each morning, prepared her day with the same deliberate pacing, ate at the same table whether alone or not. Her routines did not depend on Wyatt's participation. They had stopped overlapping, and that more than anything else defined the state of their marriage. There was no conflict, no raised voices, no visible fracture, just the quiet removal of shared structure. Wyatt, meanwhile, had stopped pretending otherwise. One evening, as he gathered his things near the door, Leah asked, "Will you be back tonight?" Wyatt didn't hesitate. "I don't think so," he said. Not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. Leah nodded once. Understood. He paused for a fraction of a second as if expecting a follow-up question. There was none, and that absence of reaction continued to unsettle him in ways he could not articulate. because conflict could be managed. Silence could not. Lila Monroe was no longer an implication. She was a presence, not in Leah's space, but in Wyatt's behavior, his schedule, his language. She appeared in references that no longer required explanation. Lila suggested we restructure the rollout. I'll be with Lila's team this afternoon. She's handling that side of it. Her name moved through conversation without hesitation, without caution, as if its significance had been normalized. Leah did not react to the name, not because it held no meaning, but because its meaning had already been accounted for. What mattered was not who Lila was, but what Wyatt had allowed her to represent. And that had been established weeks ago. Socially, the shift was even more visible. Wyatt's circle had adjusted to his new position, and with it, his new priorities. Invitations came more frequently. Exclusive gatherings, private dinners, corporate adjacent events where relationships blurred into opportunity. Leah was no longer included. Not formally, not informally. Her absence was not discussed. It was assumed. And assumption in these environments quickly became reality. At one such event, a rooftop gathering overlooking the city, Wyatt stood among colleagues, his posture relaxed, his tone confident. Jason Reed was there, as always navigating conversation with practiced ease. Megan Holt observed more than she spoke, her attention shifting between people with quiet precision. Lila stood beside Wyatt. Not close enough to draw attention, but close enough to define association. "You've settled in quickly," Jason said, raising his glass slightly. Wyatt smiled. Had to. Megan tilted her head, or wanted to. Wyatt didn't answer directly. Instead, he glanced briefly at Lila. "We're making it work," he said. The phrasing was deliberate, collective. Megan noticed. She always did. And Leah, she asked, her tone neutral. The question hung in the air for a moment longer than expected. Wyatt took a sip of his drink before responding. "She's doing her own thing," he said. Not inaccurate, but incomplete. Jason nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further. Because in that setting, clarity was less important than alignment. And Wyatt was aligned with them, with the environment, with the trajectory he had chosen. Leah was not part of that alignment anymore. At home, Leah continued her work, not visibly, not in ways that would draw attention, but consistently. The verification she had requested in the previous week had been completed. The report arrived in a secure format, structured, precise, legally compliant. She opened it in the quiet of her office. Not immediately. She allowed the moment to settle first. Then she began reading. The information confirmed what patterns had already suggested. Wyatt and Lila Monroe had been sharing accommodations during specific trips. Not always, not consistently, but enough. Dates aligned with expense reports. Locations matched internal records. Time frames overlapped with periods Wyatt had described as extended meetings. There were no photographs, no explicit statements, just documentation. Objective, unambiguous. Leah read the report once, then again, not searching for more, but ensuring there was nothing less. When she finished, she closed the file and placed it neatly beside her notebook. No reaction, no visible shift. Because confirmation did not change the trajectory. It completed it. That afternoon, Leah met with Daniel Brooks again. She handed him the report without commentary. Daniel reviewed it carefully, his expression unchanged as he moved through the pages. When he finished, he looked up. "This is definitive," he said. Leah nodded. "Yes." Daniel closed the document. "From a legal standpoint, this strengthens your position significantly." Leah's gaze remained steady. "That's not why I requested it." Daniel paused. "No." Leah shook her head once. "I requested it to remove uncertainty." Daniel considered that, and now he asked. Leah placed her hands lightly on the table. Now there is none. There was no satisfaction in her tone, no sense of resolution, just clarity. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we're approaching the point of action. I'll tell him." Leah did not respond immediately. Instead, she asked a different question. When he files, she said, "How quickly can we respond?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "Immediately." Leah nodded. Good, because timing once again mattered. Wyatt was moving toward a decision he believed he controlled. Leah was preparing for the moment he formalized it. And once it was formalized, everything would change. Not gradually, not subtly, but structurally. That evening, Wyatt returned home. Unexpectedly, Leah was in the kitchen preparing dinner. He paused for a moment, watching her not with curiosity, but with something closer to confusion. "You're cooking?" he asked. Leah glanced at him briefly. "Yes." Wyatt stepped inside, setting his keys down. "For yourself?" Leah nodded. "Yes." There was a silence that followed. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Wyatt shifted slightly. "You didn't think I'd be back." Leah turned off the stove, her movements calm. "I adjusted to the pattern," she said. Wyatt frowned. "What pattern?" Leah met his gaze. "The one you established." There was no accusation in her voice, no edge, just a statement, and that made it difficult to respond. Wyatt looked away first. "Things have been busy," he said. Leah nodded once. "I'm aware." He hesitated, then added, "It's temporary." Leah didn't answer, because both of them understood that it wasn't. Later that night, as Wyatt slept, Leah remained awake for a while longer. Her hand rested lightly against her abdomen again. The movement there was steady now, consistent, a presence that did not depend on external alignment. Leah closed her eyes briefly, not to rest, but to settle, because everything she needed was now in place. The patterns, the documentation, the confirmation. Nothing was missing. Nothing was uncertain. All that remained was timing. And Wyatt Carter, without realizing it, was moving directly toward it. Decisions, when made publicly, are rarely spontaneous. They are rehearsed long before they are spoken. Wyatt Carter had been preparing for the dinner for weeks. Not in the logistical sense, the reservation, the guest list, the setting. Those were simple, controlled, easily arranged through the networks he had become comfortable navigating. What required preparation was the narrative, the structure of what he would say, how he would position himself, how he would define Leah, and most importantly, how he would ensure that the room aligned with him before she had the opportunity to respond. Because Wyatt understood something fundamental about public spaces. Whoever spoke first shaped perception. The dinner was scheduled for a Friday evening at a private dining room in Manhattan. The kind of place that balanced exclusivity with discretion, where conversations could unfold without interruption, but never without witnesses. The guest list was deliberate. Jason Reed, Megan Holt, 2 senior partners from adjacent departments. A handful of colleagues whose opinions carried weight not formally but socially. And Lila Monroe. Her inclusion was not questioned. It was assumed. Leah received the invitation 3 days in advance, not directly from Wyatt, through a forwarded message. No personal note, no explanation, just time, location, and expectation. Leah read it once, then closed it. She did not ask Wyatt about it, because she did not need confirmation. The structure of the evening was already clear. Daniel Brooks was the only person she informed, not because she required permission, but because preparation at this stage required synchronization. "He's planning something public," Leah said during their call. Daniel didn't ask how she knew. "Do you intend to attend?" he asked. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "Then we'll be ready," Daniel replied. Leah nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Not visible," she added. "Not yet." Understood. The call ended without further detail. Because detail was no longer necessary. Everything had already been established. The day of the dinner arrived without disruption. Leah followed her routine as she always did. Morning, work, review. Nothing adjusted. Nothing accelerated. Because anticipation, when unmanaged, introduced instability. And Leah did not allow instability into her process. She dressed for the evening with the same restraint she applied to everything else. No statement pieces, no attempt to draw attention. A simple, structured dress, neutral tones, clean lines. She did not dress for the room. She dressed for herself. Wyatt left earlier than she did. "I'll meet you there," he said, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. Leah nodded. "Of course." He paused briefly as if considering whether to add something more, then didn't, and left. Leah watched the door close. Not with hesitation, not with emotion, just acknowledgement, because the evening had already begun. The restaurant was quiet in the way only certain places in Manhattan could be. Not empty, not loud, just controlled. Leah arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late. Precision once again was not about appearance. It was about alignment. A host greeted her and led her toward the private room. The door was partially open. Voices carried lightly through the space. Laughter, conversation, the low hum of familiarity. Leah stepped inside. The room shifted, not dramatically, but noticeably. Wyatt stood near the center of the table, engaged in conversation. He glanced up briefly as she entered. There was no smile, no acknowledgement beyond recognition, just a quick assessment. Leah took her seat without comment. Jason nodded politely. "Leah, Jason." Megan offered a measured smile. "Good to see you." Leah returned it. "You as well." Lila was already seated. Her gaze met Leah's for a fraction of a second, then moved away. No greeting, no tension, just absence. The evening unfolded as expected. Conversation flowed easily. Work strategy shared references that excluded Leah without explicitly doing so. She did not interrupt. She did not redirect. She observed. Not the words, the structure, who led, who followed, where Wyatt positioned himself within that dynamic, and how comfortable he had become there. Dinner was served. Courses arrived and cleared with quiet efficiency. Wine was poured, glasses raised. The rhythm of the evening built towards something, not openly, but inevitably. Leah recognized the timing before it happened, because Wyatt had been aligning the room all night, engaging the right people, establishing tone, positioning himself not just as a participant, but as a focal point. And once that alignment was complete, he stood. The shift was immediate. Not loud, but definitive. Conversations paused. Attention redirected. Wyatt Carter held the room. Leah remained seated, still, composed, watching. Because this was the moment he had been preparing for, and she had been waiting for. What Wyatt did not know was that every variable he believed he controlled had already been accounted for. He lifted his glass slightly, not for a toast, but as a gesture, a signal. "I wanted to say something," he began. His voice was steady, measured, rehearsed. The room quieted. Leah did not move, did not react, did not interrupt, because interruption would have changed the structure. And Leah was not there to change it. She was there to let it complete itself. Wyatt continued. "I think it's important," he said, "to be honest about where things stand." He paused briefly. Not for effect, for control. Leah watched him, not as a wife, but as an observer, because what he was about to say would not define her. It would define him, and that distinction mattered. Across the table, Lila Monroe lowered her gaze slightly. Jason shifted in his seat. Megan remained still. The room held its breath, waiting. And Leah Hayes said nothing, because silence in that moment was not weakness. It was position. And Wyatt Carter was about to step fully into the narrative he believed he owned. Without realizing, it was already complete. Wyatt Carter did not rush. He had rehearsed this moment too carefully to allow it to unfold without control. "I think it's important," he repeated, scanning the room briefly before letting his gaze settle not on Leah, but just past her to be clear about where things stand. There was a faint shift among the guests. Not discomfort, not yet. Just attention sharpening. Wyatt placed his glass down deliberately. "I've made the decision," he continued, "to move forward with a divorce." The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. No one interrupted. No one questioned. because the setting discouraged it. Public but controlled. Formal but personal. Exactly as Wyatt intended. Leah remained seated, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral, as if the statement had been expected, as if it had already been processed long before it was spoken. Wyatt continued. "This isn't something I take lightly," he said, his tone measured, calibrated for sympathy rather than confrontation. "But there comes a point where you have to acknowledge when things aren't working." A few subtle nods appeared around the table. Agreement, or the appearance of it. Leah observed them, not individually, but structurally. Who responded? Who remained still? Who avoided looking directly at her? Because even silence had patterns. "And I think we've reached that point," Wyatt added. Now he looked at her, briefly, just long enough to establish that she was part of the statement, not long enough to invite response. Leah met his gaze, steady, unmoved, not challenging, not yielding, just present. Wyatt looked away first. He continued speaking not to her, but to the room. "There's a difference," he said, "between a relationship that has potential and one that's just being maintained out of habit." The phrasing was deliberate, neutral, framed to avoid direct accusation. But not entirely. Over time, he went on, "You start to see where the imbalance is." That word lingered. Imbalance. Wyatt allowed it to sit for a moment before clarifying. "In contribution, in effort, in direction." Now the implication was clearer, not explicit, but unmistakable. Leah did not react, because reaction would have shifted focus, and focus in this moment belonged to Wyatt. Jason shifted slightly in his seat, his expression controlled but attentive. Megan remained still, her eyes moving between Wyatt and Leah with quiet precision. Lila Monroe lowered her gaze, though not in discomfort, in calculation. Wyatt continued. "I've taken on more responsibility over the past year," he said. "More pressure, more expectation." A pause. "And that changes things." He did not say what exactly it changed. He didn't need to. The implication was already embedded. "That kind of growth," he added, "requires alignment." Leah's hands rested lightly in her lap, still unmoved, because she recognized the structure. Wyatt was not just ending the marriage. He was defining its narrative, positioning himself as the one who had evolved, and her as the one who had not. And when that alignment isn't there, he said, you have to be honest about it. There it was again. Honesty, framed as justification, framed as necessity. Leah watched him, not with anger, not with hurt, but with clarity, because what Wyatt was presenting was not truth. It was perspective. And perspective, when stated confidently in a controlled environment, often went unchallenged. Wyatt took a breath, then continued. I don't think it's fair to either of us to keep pretending otherwise. He paused, this time longer, allowing the room to absorb the statement, allowing the narrative to settle. No one spoke, no one intervened, because the structure of the moment did not allow for interruption. Wyatt had positioned himself too carefully, and the others, whether consciously or not, respected that positioning. Leah remained silent, not because she had nothing to say, but because saying something would have altered the balance. And Leah was not there to alter it. She was there to let it reveal itself completely. Wyatt reached the final part of his statement. So I'm moving forward, he said, with legal proceedings. There was a subtle shift in tone now. Less explanation, more conclusion. I believe it's the right decision. He looked around the table briefly, not seeking approval, but acknowledging witnesses. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, I hope we can handle this, maturely. The word carried weight, not because of what it meant, but because of what it implied. That maturity in this context meant agreement, compliance, lack of resistance. Leah understood that, and she did not respond, because her silence was not agreement. It was allowance. Wyatt exhaled quietly as if releasing tension. The room remained still for a moment longer. Then gradually conversation resumed. Not immediately at full volume, but carefully, measured, as if everyone present was adjusting to the shift that had just occurred. Jason cleared his throat lightly. Well, he said, his tone neutral. These things are never easy. Wyatt nodded. No, they're not. Megan offered a small, controlled smile. Clarity matters, she said. Wyatt glanced at her briefly. It does. Lila remained silent, her gaze fixed on the table. But her presence, her proximity spoke in ways words did not. Leah observed all of it, not reacting, not engaging, just recording. Because this moment, every word, every pause, every implication was no longer just personal. It was documented, not by devices, not by recordings, but by structure, by witnesses, by alignment. And once something was spoken in a room like this, it did not disappear. It settled into memory, into perception, into consequence. Leah reached for her glass, took a small sip, then placed it back down. Her movements were calm, deliberate, unaffected, and that more than anything else created a subtle tension in the room. Because while Wyatt had just redefined the relationship, Leah had not responded. She had not defended herself. She had not challenged his claims. She had not even acknowledged the accusations embedded within his words. And that absence, that complete lack of reaction, was more difficult to process than conflict would have been. Wyatt noticed it. Of course he did. He glanced at her again, longer this time, as if awaiting for something, anything. Leah met his gaze for a brief moment, then looked away. Not dismissive, not defeated, just finished. Because for her, the moment had already passed. The narrative Wyatt believed he had just established had already been completed. And what came next would not depend on what he said, or what anyone in that room believed. It would depend on what had already been prepared, quietly, precisely, without interruption. Dinner continued. But the structure had changed, not visibly, but fundamentally. And Leah Hayes remained exactly where she had always been. Silent, observing, waiting. Not for an opportunity to speak, but for the moment when speaking would no longer be necessary. Leah Hayes did not leave the restaurant immediately after Wyatt Carter finished speaking, nor did she react in any visible way that might disrupt the carefully constructed atmosphere he had created. Instead, she remained seated long enough for the rhythm of the evening to stabilize, allowing conversations to resume voices, to regain their normal tone, and the illusion of continuity to settle back into place. To anyone observing from a distance, it might have appeared as though the moment had already been absorbed, categorized as an uncomfortable but contained event, something to be processed later privately without consequence. Leah understood that perception, and she allowed it. Because perception, especially in controlled environments, often delayed recognition of reality. She excused herself only when it no longer drew attention, offering a brief nod to no one in particular before standing and stepping away from the table. There were no final words, no attempt to reclaim dignity through response, no effort to correct what had been said. Her silence remained intact, not as an absence, but as a completed position. Wyatt watched her leave, not openly, but through the reflection in the glass behind the table. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if a part of him had expected resistance, and in its absence found nothing to anchor against. The door closed behind Leah with a quiet finality. Outside, the city moved as it always did, uninterrupted, indifferent, illuminated by the steady rhythm of traffic and light. Leah stepped onto the sidewalk, the evening air cool against her skin, and paused for a brief moment, not to gather herself, but to transition. Because the next phase had already begun. The following morning did not announce itself with urgency. There was no sudden escalation, no visible reaction from the company, no immediate disruption to Wyatt's world. The systems within Hayes Global Holdings did not operate on impulse, nor did they respond to personal events without structure. They responded to information, and that information had been prepared. At precisely 8:30 a.m., an internal email was distributed across the executive tier of Hayes Global and its primary subsidiaries, including Carter and Vale Logistics. The sender, Margaret Ellis, The subject line was neutral. Organizational structure, update, confidential. The language within the email was precise, formal, and devoid of interpretation. It outlined a clarification of ownership structure, something that on the surface appeared administrative rather than consequential. However, as recipients moved through the document, the implications became increasingly clear. Hayes, Global Holdings, long understood to be governed by a distributed executive model, was in fact majority-controlled through a single private trust. That trust was held by one individual, Leah Hayes. The document did not emphasize the revelation. It did not frame it as significant. It simply stated it as fact, accompanied by supporting documentation, verified, complete, and distributed simultaneously across all relevant channels. Wyatt Carter read the email at his desk. At first, he did not process it, not fully. He skimmed the opening lines, expecting routine information, the kind of structural update that required acknowledgement but not attention. However, as he reached the section detailing ownership, his focus sharpened, then stopped. He read the name once. Then again. Leah Hayes. For a moment, his mind rejected the connection, because the name existed in two separate contexts in his life. His wife and a distant, abstract figure tied to a corporate structure he had never needed to examine closely. Now those contexts had collapsed into one. He leaned back in his chair slowly, the email still open on his screen, the words unchanged but no longer neutral. Around him, the office began to shift. Not loudly, not visibly, but perceptibly. Colleagues who had read the same email were processing it in real time. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes moved between screens and each other, seeking confirmation, without asking for it directly. Jason Reed stood near the edge of the room, his expression carefully controlled, though his posture betrayed a subtle tension. Megan Holt remained seated, her gaze fixed on her monitor, but her stillness carried a different weight, now focused analytical recalibrating. No one spoke Wyatt's name. But the space around him had changed, because information once revealed at that level did not remain isolated. It restructured perception instantly. Wyatt looked back at the email, scrolled, checked the attachments, the verification, the legal confirmations. Everything aligned. There was no ambiguity, no room for reinterpretation. The woman he had publicly dismissed the night before was the controlling owner of the company that defined his professional identity. Leah, at that same moment, was seated in her office. Not watching, not waiting, just continuing. She had reviewed the email before it was sent, ensuring that its tone remained consistent with the company's communication standards. There were no emotional undertones, no implication of timing, no connection drawn between personal and corporate contexts. It was not a response. It was a clarification, and that distinction preserved its integrity. Her phone remained silent. She did not expect it to ring, because those who understood the email would not call. They would adjust. Those who did not understand it would hesitate. And Wyatt would recognize it, not as an attack, but as a realization. Within Carter and Vail Logistics, the shift accelerated. A meeting was called, not formally by Leah, but internally as leadership attempted to interpret the implications of the update. Senior managers gathered in a conference room, documents open, questions forming, but not yet spoken. Wyatt was included. Of course he was. His position required it. But his presence now carried a different weight. He entered the room with the same composure he had maintained the night before, but the environment no longer aligned with it. Conversations paused when he approached. Not out of respect, but recalibration. Jason glanced at him briefly, then away. Megan met his eyes for a fraction of a second longer than usual, her expression unreadable. The meeting began. Structured, measured, focused on interpretation rather than reaction. "What does this mean for reporting lines?" one executive asked. "Ownership doesn't change operational autonomy," another replied. "It might, depending on involvement." The discussion remained technical, safe, avoiding the personal implications that lingered beneath the surface. Wyatt did not speak immediately. He listened, not because he chose to, but because he needed to, because the structure he had believed he understood had just been revealed as incomplete, and within that incompleteness was exposure. Leah received the first formal acknowledgement from the board shortly after. A brief message, professional, respectful, requesting a scheduled meeting to discuss next steps. She confirmed, not urgently, not defensively, just precisely. Because what came next would not be reactive. It would be procedural. Wyatt left the meeting early, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had already reached a conclusion. He returned to his office, closed the door, and sat down. For the first time since reading the email, he allowed himself to think fully. Not about the company, not about the meeting, but about Leah, the dinner, her silence, her lack of reaction, the way she had watched him not with emotion but with something else. Something he had not understood at the time, but understood now, because nothing in her behavior had been uncertain. Nothing had been unprepared. And that realization, more than the email, more than the company, more than the implications, was what unsettled him. Because it meant she had known all of it, before he ever spoke. Leah closed her laptop, not because there was nothing left to do, but because this phase was complete. The structure had shifted. The information had been revealed. And Wyatt Carter was no longer operating within the narrative he had created. He was inside one he did not control. The shift from realization to consequence did not happen instantly, but it began immediately. Within Hayes, global holdings processes that had remained dormant now activated with quiet precision. No alarms were triggered, no public statements were issued, and no individual was singled out in any visible manner. Instead, internal mechanisms adjusted in a way that only those familiar with the system would recognize. Margaret Ellis initiated the first formal audit request under a routine classification. It was not labeled as an investigation. It was framed as a compliance review. That distinction mattered, because compliance reviews did not provoke resistance. They invited cooperation. And cooperation in environments where individuals believed they were still in control often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Wyatt Carter received the notification just before noon. The language was neutral, almost impersonal, outlining the scope of the review and the departments involved. His name was not highlighted, but his division was included. And the categories being examined aligned precisely with the patterns Leah had already documented. He read the message carefully, then again searching for emphasis that was not there. There was no accusation, no implication, just structure. Yet the timing was impossible to ignore. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, the quiet hum of the office surrounding him, now carrying a different tone. Conversations seemed softer, more measured, as if everyone was aware of something without acknowledging it directly. Jason Reed approached his desk a few minutes later. "You saw the audit notice?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Wyatt nodded. "Yeah, probably routine." Jason hesitated, then gave a slight shrug. "Maybe," he said. But the uncertainty in his tone remained, because even routine processes, when paired with new information, acquired different meaning. Wyatt closed the email, not dismissing it, but containing it, because to react too quickly would expose concern. And concern in his position was something he could not afford to display. Across the office, Megan Holt was already reviewing the documentation attached to the notice. Her focus was steady, analytical, her posture unchanged, but her attention sharper than before. She was not reacting emotionally. She was recalibrating, because the presence of Leah Hayes in the ownership structure had altered every assumption, including the ones Wyatt had been operating under. That afternoon, the first requests for documentation were sent. Expense reports, travel justifications, internal approvals, nothing unusual, nothing outside standard procedure. But the specificity of the requests narrowed the scope in a way that suggested direction. Wyatt received his portion shortly after. He opened the file and began reviewing the list. Dates aligned, categories matched, and the entries were familiar. Too familiar. He recognized them not as isolated transactions, but as part of a pattern he had never expected anyone to map. Dinners categorized as client engagement. Travel extensions justified as operational necessity. Adjustments made quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. At the time, they had seemed insignificant. Now placed together, they formed something else entirely. Wyatt exhaled slowly, then began gathering the requested documents. Not rushing, not hesitating, because the only viable response was compliance. Anything else would create visibility. And visibility at this stage was risk. Meanwhile, Leah Hayes remained outside the immediate process. She did not attend the audit meetings. She did not issue directives. She did not interfere, because interference would compromise the structure. And the structure was already functioning as intended. Margaret provided updates through secure channels, each report concise, factual, and free of interpretation. The data was beginning to align. Patterns were no longer implied. They were visible. Repeated expense anomalies tied to Wyatt's authorization. Consistent overlap between his travel records and Lila Monroe's schedule. Internal communications, indicating category adjustments that bypassed standard protocols. None of it was dramatic. None of it was overtly illegal in isolation. But together, it formed a framework of misuse. And frameworks, once established, did not require exaggeration. They spoke for themselves. Leah reviewed each update without visible reaction. Her role was not to interpret. It was to ensure completeness, because completeness eliminated doubt. And doubt was the only defense Wyatt might still rely on. That evening, Wyatt returned home earlier than expected. The apartment was quiet. Leah was seated at the table, a folder open in front of her, though its contents were not immediately visible. He paused for a moment, observing her. Not with curiosity, but with a new awareness. "You saw the email," he said. It was not a question. Leah looked up. "Yes." Wyatt stepped further into the room, placing his keys down more carefully than usual. "You didn't mention it." Leah closed the folder gently. "There was nothing to clarify," she replied. Wyatt frowned slightly. "That's not exactly minor information." Leah met his gaze. "No," she said. There was a brief silence, not tense, but waited. Wyatt shifted his stance. "You could have told me," he said. The statement carried more than an observation. It carried implication. Leah considered him for a moment. Would it have changed anything, she asked? Wyatt did not answer immediately, because the question required him to consider something beyond his own perspective. And that was not where his focus had been. "I don't know," he said finally. Leah nodded once. Then it wasn't relevant. The response was calm, precise, and it removed the possibility of argument. Wyatt exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "There's an audit," he said, as if introducing new information. "I'm aware." "You're aware," he repeated. Leah's expression did not change. "Yes." Another pause. Wyatt looked at her, searching again for something he could engage with. Reaction, concern, emotion. There was none. Only clarity. "It's probably routine," he said. Leah did not challenge the statement. "Then there's nothing to worry about," she replied. Wyatt held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, because the conversation offered no entry point, no leverage, no alignment, only a reflection of what already existed. That night, the distance between them felt different, not wider, but defined, because uncertainty had been removed. Wyatt was no longer operating under assumption. He was operating under exposure, and exposure changed behavior. Not immediately, but inevitably. In the days that followed, the audit deepened. Additional documentation was requested. Clarifications were required. Timelines were cross-referenced. The process remained quiet, controlled, but its direction was no longer ambiguous. Lila Monroe was also included. Her department received similar requests aligned with Wyatt's records. She responded with professionalism, her demeanor unchanged, her communication precise. But internally, the structure around her was tightening. Because alignment between two individuals once mapped through data extended responsibility. And responsibility in corporate environments did not distribute evenly. It accumulated. Wyatt began to feel that accumulation, not as accusation, but as pressure. Subtle at first, then consistent. Because every document he submitted added context. Every clarification he provided closed another gap. And gaps were the only places uncertainty could exist. Leah, meanwhile, remained still. Not disengaged, but complete. She had moved beyond preparation, beyond observation, and into resolution. Not because she had acted, but because the structure she had built was now acting on its own. And when structure reached that point, it no longer required direction. Only time. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 9:00 a.m. It was not announced widely, nor framed as urgent, but within Hayes Global Holdings, those who needed to know understood the significance of timing. The audit had reached a stage where interpretation was no longer sufficient. It required acknowledgement at the highest level. Wyatt Carter received the calendar invitation late Monday evening. There was nothing unusual about the format. A standard executive session, limited attendees' confidential agenda. His presence was expected, not optional. He read the invitation twice before accepting it. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. And understanding in this case did not provide clarity. It removed it. The conference room occupied the top floor of the building, a space designed for decisions that carried weight beyond immediate consequence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, though the view often went unnoticed during meetings like this. Inside, the arrangement was deliberate. A long table, minimal materials, no unnecessary presence. Margaret Ellis was already seated when the first members arrived. Her posture composed her attention, focused on the documents in front of her. She acknowledged each person with a slight nod, offering no commentary, no indication of what was to come. Jason Reed entered next, his usual confidence tempered by something quieter, more measured. Megan Holt followed shortly after, her expression neutral but attentive, her eyes moving briefly across the room before settling into stillness. Wyatt arrived last, not intentionally, but inevitably. His timing placed him at the edge of the room's attention without allowing him control over it. He took his seat without speaking. Margaret glanced at him briefly, then returned her focus to the table. The meeting began precisely on time. No preamble, Margaret said, her voice calm, direct. We'll proceed with the audit findings. There was no introduction, no contextual framing. Because context at this level was already understood. Margaret opened the first document. What you have in front of you, she continued, is a consolidated summary of financial activity within Carter and Vail Logistics over the past 2 quarters, with specific focus on discretionary spending categories. She paused, allowing the room to align. The data reflects patterns that require clarification. The phrasing remained neutral, but the structure was not. Margaret proceeded through the report methodically. Expense categories, data alignments, authorization chains. Each section built upon the last, not through interpretation, but through accumulation. Wyatt listened, not interrupting, not reacting, because every detail presented was already familiar to him. He had seen the documents. He had submitted the clarifications. But here in this room, the information existed differently. It was no longer isolated. It was structured, and structure changed perception. Megan leaned slightly forward, her attention fixed on the data. These entries, she said at one point, indicating a section of the report, they exceed standard thresholds for client engagement. Margaret nodded. They do. Jason glanced toward Wyatt briefly, then back to the table. Were these approved at a higher level? He asked. Margaret turned a page. No additional approvals were recorded. The absence of commentary carried more weight than explanation would have. Wyatt remained still. His hands rested on the table. His posture controlled his expression, unchanged. because reacting would not alter the information. And silence at this point was the only position that preserved any measure of control. Margaret continued. Further alignment between travel records and internal scheduling indicates overlap with non-declared participants. She did not say the name immediately. She did not need to, because the next page made it clear. Lila Monroe. The room did not react outwardly, but the shift was immediate, not in volume, in attention. Megan's gaze moved slightly, recalibrating. Jason exhaled quietly, his posture adjusting by a fraction. Wyatt felt it. Not his accusation, but his recognition. Margaret closed the document. That concludes the summary, she said. There was a brief silence, not uncertain, not hesitant, just complete. Then she spoke again. Before we proceed further, she said there is an additional clarification required. The door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the room's focus. Leah Hayes entered. She did not rush. She did not pause. She walked to the head of the table and took her seat with the same measured composure she had maintained throughout every phase of this process. No one spoke immediately. Not because they were surprised, but because her presence redefined the structure of the room. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "Leah," she said. Leah nodded. "Thank you, Margaret." Her voice was calm, even, unemotional. She placed a single folder on the table in front of her. Not large, not dramatic, just precise. "I'll keep this brief," Leah said. She did not look at Wyatt immediately. She addressed the room. "The information presented reflects a pattern," she continued, "not an isolated issue." She opened the folder. Inside were documents, aligned, categorized, complete. "These are supporting records," she said. "They confirm the alignment between internal financial activity and external behavior. No emphasis, no accusation, just confirmation." Megan spoke first. "This extends beyond compliance," she said. Leah met her gaze. "Yes." Jason shifted slightly. "What is the recommendation?" he asked. Leah closed the folder. "The recommendation is procedural," she replied. She turned her attention finally to Wyatt. Not with emotion, not with judgment, just clarity. "Effective immediately," she said, "Wyatt Carter is suspended from operational duties pending full review." The words settled into the room without resistance, because resistance required uncertainty, and there was none. Wyatt did not respond. Not immediately, because the structure of the moment did not allow for negotiation. Everything that could have been said had already been documented. He looked at Leah, really looked at her, for the first time without assumption, without narrative, without control. And what he saw was not reaction, not retaliation, but completion. Leah held his gaze for a brief moment, then looked away. Not dismissive, not final, just finished. Margaret closed the meeting. "We'll proceed accordingly," she said. No one objected. No one questioned. Because the outcome had not been decided in this room. It had been built long before it, and now it was simply being acknowledged. Wyatt remained seated for a moment after the others began to leave. Not because he didn't understand what had happened, but because understanding required adjustment. And adjustment in this case was not immediate. Leah stood, gathered her folder, and walked toward the door. She did not look back, because there was nothing left to observe. The structure had completed itself, and Wyatt Carter was no longer part of it. The legal proceedings did not begin with confrontation. They began with documentation. Wyatt Carter received the formal filing 3 days after the board meeting, delivered through his attorney, Kevin Doyle, in a format that left no room for interpretation. The documents were complete, structured with the same precision that had defined every step leading up to this moment. There were no emotional statements, no unnecessary language, no attempt to frame the narrative beyond what could be proven. Leah Hayes had not responded to his public declaration at dinner. She had responded here, through structure, through sequence, through evidence. Wyatt sat in Kevin Doyle's office, the file open in front of him, though he had already read it once before arriving. His posture remained composed, but the stillness now carried a different weight, one that was no longer rooted in control, but in recognition. Kevin leaned back in his chair, his expression measured professional, but no longer neutral. "This changes the position," he said. Wyatt did not look up immediately. "I can see that." Kevin tapped the document lightly. The financial disclosures alone would have shifted things, he continued. "But this," he paused, selecting his words carefully, "this establishes a pattern." Wyatt's jaw tightened slightly. A pattern of what, he asked. Kevin met his gaze. "Misrepresentation," he said, "and misuse of corporate resources." There was no accusation in his tone, just clarity. Wyatt exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. She didn't say anything, he said, almost to himself. Kevin did not respond immediately, because what Wyatt was referring to had already been accounted for. "She didn't need to," Kevin said finally. The room fell quiet, not tense, not hostile, just definitive. Wyatt closed the file, not abruptly, but with a finality that suggested he understood something he had not been prepared to face. "This isn't just divorce," he said. Kevin nodded. "No," he replied, "it's not. The court proceedings were scheduled quickly, not because of urgency, but because there was nothing to delay. Both sides were prepared. Both sides had documentation. But only one side had completeness. The courtroom itself was unremarkable, as most are. Neutral walls structured seating a space designed to remove emotion rather than accommodate it. There were no observers beyond those required, no audience to witness the outcome, no spectacle to frame the moment as anything beyond procedural. Leah arrived early, not to prepare, but to align. She sat quietly beside Daniel Brooks, reviewing the documents one final time, not because they required revision, but because repetition ensured clarity. Daniel glanced at her briefly. "You're ready," he said. Leah nodded. Yes. There was no further discussion, because readiness at this stage was not about confidence. It was about completion. Wyatt entered a few minutes later with Kevin Doyle. He did not look at Leah immediately, not out of avoidance, but because the structure of the room had shifted in a way he was still adjusting to. The roles were no longer personal. They were defined. And within that definition, his position had changed. The proceedings began without delay. The judge moved through the initial formalities with efficiency, acknowledging both parties, confirming representation, and outlining the structure of the hearing. Daniel spoke first, not loudly, not forcefully, just precisely. He presented the case as it existed: a marriage, a shift in behavior, a series of documented actions that aligned with both personal and corporate implications. There was no emphasis on betrayal, no appeal to emotion, just sequence. Dates, records, verification. Leah remained still beside him, her presence consistent, her expression unchanged. Because this was not her moment to speak, it was her moment to confirm. Kevin Doyle responded as expected. He did not deny the existence of the records. He did not challenge the documentation. Instead, he attempted to reframe. These actions, he said, must be understood within context. The word lingered. Context. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Then we'll remain within context," he replied. And he did. He presented the financial records, the expense alignments, the internal audit findings, each piece layered over the last, not to overwhelm, but to remove alternatives. Because context, when complete, did not require interpretation. It required acknowledgement. Wyatt listened, not interrupting, not reacting. Because every argument Kevin introduced was already constrained by the structure Leah had built. There was no space for reinterpretation, no gap for doubt, only confirmation. At one point, the judge addressed Wyatt directly. "Do you dispute the records presented?" he asked. Wyatt hesitated, not because he was uncertain, but because the answer once given would define the remainder of the proceedings. "No," he said. The words settled into the room with quiet finality. There was no follow-up, no elaboration, because none was necessary. The rest unfolded as expected. Division of assets, custody considerations, financial responsibility. Each element addressed not through negotiation, but through alignment with the existing documentation. Leah did not speak unless required. And when she did, her words were minimal. Yes, no, I confirm, nothing more, because nothing more was needed. There was no attempt to diminish Wyatt, no effort to expose him beyond what had already been established. Because exposure, once complete, did not benefit from repetition. And Leah was not there to punish. She was there to conclude. The ruling, when delivered, reflected that structure. Wyatt Carter would relinquish significant financial claims, not as penalty, but as consequence. Custody arrangements favored Leah, supported by stability documentation and continuity. Corporate implications were acknowledged separately to be handled outside the court's jurisdiction. The marriage, in legal terms, was dissolved. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just completely. After the proceedings ended, Wyatt remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. The room began to empty around him, voices low, movements efficient, the structure dissolving back into ordinary space. Kevin placed a hand lightly on the table. "We'll review next steps," he said. Wyatt nodded, but did not move, because movement into that moment required acceptance. And acceptance was still forming. Across the room, Leah stood. She gathered her documents with the same precision she had maintained from the beginning. No urgency, no hesitation. Daniel spoke quietly beside her. "It's done," he said. Leah nodded. Yes. She did not look at Wyatt, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to address. The process had completed. The structure had held. And the outcome had already been decided long before it was spoken. Leah walked toward the exit. Each step measured, unhurried, unaffected. She did not pause. She did not turn, because closure for her did not require acknowledgement. It required movement. And she had already begun. The city did not change when Leah Hayes left it. New York continued its movement with the same indifference it had always maintained, absorbing departures without pause, replacing presence with motion, never marking the absence of any single individual as significant. Buildings remained, lights continued, conversations unfolded in spaces Leah would no longer occupy. That more than anything made her departure complete. She did not leave abruptly. There was no dramatic exit, no final moment designed to signal closure. Instead, she transitioned gradually, aligning each step with the same precision that had defined everything before. Legal documents were finalized. Corporate structures were stabilized. Authority was delegated where necessary, not relinquished, but redistributed in a way that ensured continuity without dependence on her physical presence. Hayes Global Holdings continued to operate. Margaret Ellis remained in her role, maintaining oversight with the same quiet discipline that had supported both Leah and her father before her. The board functioned as it always had, structured, procedural, unaffected by the absence of public disruption. Leah did not withdraw from the company. She simply removed herself from its daily visibility, because visibility had never been her method of control. She relocated to a smaller coastal town, several hours away from the city, a place where time moved differently, not slower, but with less urgency attached to it. The environment did not demand attention. It allowed for presence without expectation. Her new home was understated, not minimal but intentional. Large windows facing the water, natural light that shifted throughout the day without interruption from surrounding structures. No excess, no statement, just space. Leah did not fill it immediately. She allowed the rooms to remain open, unoccupied, in ways that invited adjustment rather than completion. Because this phase of her life was not about rebuilding. It was about redefining. Her son was born in early autumn. The process was quiet, private, structured around necessity rather than experience. There were no extended announcements, no public acknowledgement beyond what was required legally and administratively. The hospital staff knew her only as Leah Hayes, without context, without association. And that was enough. When she held him for the first time, there was no visible shift in her composure, no overwhelming display of emotion. But there was recognition, not of responsibility, that had already been understood, but of continuity, something that extended beyond structure, beyond control, beyond outcome. She named him Elias. The name carried no corporate weight, no inherited expectation, just clarity. Life settled into a rhythm that did not resemble what came before. Leah's days were structured, but not constrained. She maintained oversight of Hayes Global through secure channels, reviewing reports, approving decisions, ensuring alignment without direct intervention. The system functioned as designed. It did not require her presence to remain stable, and that stability allowed her to redirect her attention. Not entirely, but intentionally. Elias became the center of her daily structure, not in a way that disrupted her identity, but in a way that redefined priority, feeding schedules, sleep patterns, small, consistent adjustments that required attention not because they were complex, but because they were continuous. Leah approached them the same way she approached everything else, with observation, with consistency, with patience. Wyatt Carter remained in the city, not by choice, but by default, because leaving required direction, and direction was something he no longer possessed. The consequences of the audit had extended beyond suspension. His position at Carter and Vale Logistics was terminated following the completion of the internal review. The documentation had not supported retention, and the company, now operating under clarified ownership, had no reason to preserve his role. Lila Monroe had also been affected, not to the same degree, but enough to alter her trajectory. Her involvement, while less direct, had aligned closely enough with the findings to limit her advancement within the company. She remained employed for a time, but her position shifted, responsibility reduced, visibility removed. Eventually, she left. Not publicly, not dramatically, just absent. Wyatt's professional reputation adjusted accordingly. Not destroyed, but redefined. He was no longer considered reliable within the structures that had once supported him. Opportunities became limited, not through rejection, but through omission. He was no longer included. And in environments like his, absence of inclusion was its own form of consequence. He attempted to rebuild. New applications, new positions, smaller companies, different structures. But alignment proved difficult, because past behavior once documented did not disappear. It followed, quietly, consistently, much like everything else. Leah did not follow his trajectory. She did not monitor his progress. She did not request updates, because his outcome was no longer relevant to her structure. It had been resolved, completely. One afternoon, months later, Leah stood by the window of her home, Elias resting quietly in her arms. The ocean stretched beyond the glass, its surface shifting with a rhythm that required no intervention. The light moved across the room, slowly changing the shape of shadows without altering their presence. Leah adjusted her hold slightly, ensuring Elias remained comfortable. He slept without awareness of what had come before, without connection to the structures that had defined the decisions leading to this moment, and that more than anything was intentional. Leah had not preserved her silence to prove a point. She had not allowed the process to unfold as it did to create consequence. She had done it to ensure that what came next would not inherit instability. Her phone rested on the table behind her. Unread messages, routine updates, nothing urgent, nothing requiring immediate response, because urgency in her world had already been addressed. What remained was continuity. Leah looked out at the horizon, not searching, not reflecting, just present. Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to observe, nothing left to prepare, nothing left to complete. The structure had held, the outcome had been defined, and the future did not require correction, only continuation. Leah Hayes did not win. She did not defeat. She did not return anything that had been done to her. She simply chose when to act and when to remain still. And in that choice, Everything else followed. In the end, the story was never about exposure. It was never about revenge or humiliation or reclaiming something that had been taken in a single moment. It was about time. About what happens when someone chooses not to react immediately, not to argue, not to defend themselves in the space where they are underestimated. Leah understood something that most people only realize too late, that truth does not need urgency to exist, and that silence, when held with intention, is not weakness, but structure waiting to complete itself. Wyatt believed he controlled the moment when he stood in that room and spoke, believing that defining the narrative first would allow him to shape the outcome. What he did not understand was that the outcome had already been shaped long before he said a word. Not loudly, not visibly, but precisely. And when it finally unfolded, it did not need explanation. It only needed acknowledgement. Leah did not stay to watch it. She did not measure her life against what he lost. She did not look back to confirm that the consequences had reached him, because moving forward for her was never dependent on what remained behind. If you followed this story to the end, then you already understand that sometimes the strongest response is the one no one hears. If this resonated with you, you can leave a like. If you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to share where you are and what time it is where you're listening. And if you believe in stories where strength doesn't need to be loud to be undeniable, you may already know whether to stay for the next one.